AI is not going to take your job. Someone using AI is going to take your job. So the important thing about AI is to understand it is not one thing, and then how will you use it to make a difference? So AI is not a replacement for being an expert in your topic. You still need to be an expert in your topic. You need to know the organization that you're working with and what the little variables are that are going to trip up the AI. So definitely get good at your job. But if I were going to say one thing everybody could learn, it's learning to write prompts to be effective. So often when we look at data today in our daily lives, it's information. Data analysts and data specialists think of it in a different way. They think of it as assets and building blocks. And a few classes in data quality will teach you to shift your perspective. That shift in perspective will then help you understand which part of it you love the most, right? And then how to advise people about data. So what's happened where IT is converging into supply chain is because at the heart of it, both IT folks like myself and now a supply chain person and yourself, we love our jobs and we want to be really great at it. And we recognize that when we were split apart like that, neither of us were going to win, because we didn't have enough information. We have to start blending in order to keep up and really help our organizations. So if I'm an HR person, I'm going to be really concerned about that because I need leaders. And I need leaders in particular who can lead both AI and humans, right? So human leadership, we've all been working on this for a really long time, and we understand how to bring out the best in people. But how do I find a leader who knows how to bring out the best in AI? Because that's a thing. That will be a thing. We're going to have AI agents doing jobs that humans used to do. They're going to need to be managed. You can't let them just run wild, or you end up with Terminator and Skynet, right? So
hello and welcome to another podcast on my channel. And I'm really excited today because we have a very interesting topic for discussion today. And we keep hearing about new technologies in the world of supply chain, like AI, like machine learning, like digital twins, Internet of Things, and so on. But it's very hard to find some success stories on where these things have been implemented in supply chain. And most importantly, how can supply chain professionals who are interested in the future jobs, which will employ these skills, can upskill themselves and learn these new technologies in a way which makes them more marketable for future. And in order to talk about this, I've got someone who is a perfect person for this discussion. She is the senior technologies lead at Mars. And in the past, she has also worked as an industry advisor for manufacturing and supply chain digital technologies for different industry organizations. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Aileen Sanoval to the podcast. Hi, Aileen. How are you?
Hi, Jamil. Thanks so much for making time today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. And it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And you know that we've been trying to do this for a long time. And I'm so glad that you had the time to do this session with me. So, Aileen, first of all, for my audience, I know we know each other and we have worked a lot in the past. But can you just give a quick introduction about your career journey and then what makes you excited about digital technologies and supply chain?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, it's been great to get to know you over the last number of years. And I do have a strange journey. So I started in the industry before there were really a lot of degrees. I'm older than I look, and I'm in my 50s. So when I went to college, there weren't degrees in supply chain and there weren't degrees in computer science and things like that, at least not at most colleges. So it's really stumbled into technology, like a lot of people my age, where I was a really good project manager. I really had could quickly grasp ideas. I was around at some key moments, like moving from DOS to Windows systems and Y2K. And I was able to distinguish myself through my performance in my job. So even though I didn't have a degree in the topic, I did have a different college degree, which made me eligible for the roles. And then I just kept building on my experience, looking for those stretch projects, looking for those tough things that no one else wanted to do, and distinguished myself along the way until I found myself as a senior project manager being asked to work on some e-commerce projects back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when e-commerce was really first starting and we were all trying to figure it all out. Using those projects as a launching point, I really started getting into supply chain because the e-commerce projects were with a publisher. And publishers at that time were doing both direct fulfillment and kind of bookstore level fulfillment. There was no Amazon. Or Amazon was a distant threat. Ebooks were a distant threat. And we were still printing and publishing and packaging up boxes. So my very first supply chain project was the implementation of a Pitney Bowes pick-to-light system for a publishing house. And that exposed me to the complexities of supply chain and the way that the problems are just so interrelated and so complicated to solve. And I fell in love. So since that time, I sought out other supply chain projects. I sought out projects that complemented that and eventually found myself working primarily in supply chain.
Awesome. That's an excellent journey. And I think, Aileen, you are just a accidental supply chain technology
I
expert.
am.
Like I'm an accidental supply chain professional.
Yes.
Because I have a very similar story. I am actually an engineer. I applied to a factory job, assuming that they are going to make me work on machines.
Mhm.
But then they said that, at that time I was applying for Procter and Gamble, and they said, there is no job in the factory, but there is a supply planning manager job, and would you like to do it? And I said, I have no
I
idea
don't
what
know.
supply chain is. And they said,
Yeah.
don't worry, we'll teach you. And then rest is history, right? So,
Right.
and then I realized how exciting this field is. So
Yeah.
maybe I'll go to my first question, Aileen, which is the buzzword these days is
Mhm.
AI.
Yeah.
Everybody's talking about AI. And of course, now we are beginning to use AI even in our personal lives,
Mhm.
Chat GPT, Gemini, and so on, right? But one thing which I personally, even as a supply chain professional,
Mhm.
find hard is where I find some good implementations of where AI has really benefited supply chain in some of the
Mhm.
common problems we face every day. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the important thing to remember with AI is it's actually a very big landscape of tools. It's a little bit like saying transportation. Well, transportation means 6 or 7 different things and then 6 or 7 variations of that. It's the same with AI. There are lots and lots of applications and expressions of it in our work. I heard a great quote the other day from an economist that I think is important to remember as well. It's like AI is not going to take your job. Someone using AI is going to take your job. So the important thing about AI is to understand it is not one thing, and then how will you use it to make a difference? And I think some of the use cases we've seen that really make a difference are the obvious ones you think of right away. Anytime you're analyzing a gigantic set of data and need to come to a conclusion quickly. So planning is a great use case for AI because it can process larger sets of data. That's the key with AI and where it makes a difference. It's going to churn through more data using rules that you set up to get you to a set of aggregate suggestions or recommendations or analysis. And for things like forecasting, that's the perfect application. And I saw a use case the other day in a Harvard Business Review article where a company had used AI models that they built internally to analyze for demand drift, right? So this is when your demand signal is changing subtly over time. Your demand planners are not picking up on the changes, or they know it's changing, but they're not sure what the pattern is. And all they can say is, I think it's right, right? So being able to churn through all of that demand data versus actuals will then be able to tell you what your drift looks like. And the drift pattern can tell you what to anticipate to prevent future stockouts, right? So anytime you've got a large set of data is when AI can be brought to the table if you have the right models already trained on your data, right? Or if you have a provider who can help you with those. Another example that is maybe easier to grasp where you don't need quite as big a data set beforehand would be like contract enforcement. So all of us are working against SLAs, whether they're inbound SLAs for us from suppliers or outbound SLAs to our customers. We have those documents, right? We've got tons and tons of documents, hopefully probably spread across email, maybe in a knowledge repository. If you train an AI against that analyzes contract language, you can draw out the contract terms and then compare it to your actuals in the data and see where you've got lack of enforcement or you've got gaps in your contract, and then you can pursue penalties. And anyone who's ever had to deal with POA verification knows what a challenge that can be. So I think contract enforcement is another really good, very easy to grasp example of how AI can be used in supply chain. After that, it's things like what if planning, because once you've learned to use the AI tool for those big data sets and you're getting consistent answers that you can believe in, then you can use the AI tools to do what if scenarios for what if we lost a supplier, what if there was disruption, what if we changed our distribution pattern, what if we needed to do network redesign, what if we needed to intervene. And you begin to actually build up the kind of the skill set or the knowledge of the scenarios yourself as a human, that you can look at and say, oh, this solution for this problem, then the next time it comes up, you're ready to go.
Great. Now, one thing I want to just go a little bit deeper into the planning aspect of supply chain here, because it's also my favorite topic,
Yeah.
right? Which is we have been talking about supply chain control towers, demand sensing for almost more than 10 years now, because the concepts are not new. But in the last 3 to 4 years, we can see almost like a huge spike in AI's capabilities, or maybe now just, as common people, we are seeing what AI can actually do. How do you think AI can help with that visibility problem? Whether, because there's always this perpetual desire in supply chain to see end to end in the form of a control tower, or make some decisions based on a customer, going out of stock, and then how do you use that information to change your production plan, right? So, any suggestions or ideas on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've kind of nailed it, right? So we've all wanted that for a long time. Everybody wants to be able to see what's happening and do controlled change to your supply chain. What's changed is AI, right? So that is what has changed in the last couple of years, the actual ability to get those big data sets and use the data without having to standardize the data. So in the past, 5-6 years ago, when we tried to build those tools, we would have to standardize all the data into the same format, put it into a data lake, and then put the analysis on top of the data lake, or the analysis wouldn't work because the reports wouldn't print, the visualizations weren't accurate enough, people would question the data. So there was this constant effort to clean the data and get it standard and get it in and then look at it. And that just is not responsive enough for business, right? So that's why it wasn't as effective in the past, or was extremely expensive to do in the past. But the new AI tools allow us to process bigger data sets without standardizing them, right? So the advancements we've seen in data analytics say, I can take 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 diverse data sets and use large language models against those data sets without putting them all in the same place or standardizing the data so that everything means the same. I just have to design it so that the AI tool knows that X factory date means this when it's this factory, and that when it's that factory, and that when it's that warehouse. So I can define the world, and then the AI tool can actually process against it much faster, which makes things like control towers, digital twins, more advanced analytics. That makes that all possible. So I think that's the big shift for end-to-end visibility. However, I would warn on using it without verifying it, because the end-to-end problems are tough for humans to understand, right? So it's all about, can the human train the AI engine to do it for them? It's augmentation, not replacement. So you have to have enough knowledge experts pulled together working on that project build in order to get to the model that's going to be effective. If you just allow a vendor to do it for you, so this is my caution, if you hire a really, really qualified firm to do it for you, they will do their absolute best to give you what you're looking for, but they don't know your business. So they're going to make mistakes in the rules, which are going to give you bad results. So if you are looking to really leap into that end-to-end analysis, make sure that you've got the people like yourself, Jamil, and other business representatives with you to help you define those rules, because that's the hardest part.
Got you. Yeah, and I think that advice is pretty consistent with using AI in general, right? For example,
Yes.
a little bit of an, I would say, off-topic example, but I use AI a lot even for my YouTube channel, content creation, and all of that, right? But one thing which I I've learned this the hard way myself, and I also advise to anyone who is getting into this space is, don't take the AI output on face value, right? I think where it really adds value is AI saves your time in certain things. but
Yeah,
then we have to blend artificial intelligence with human intelligence,
exactly.
because only then you can make sense of the data and make it useful. So I guess
Yeah.
it's the same advice. And I think on that topic, one of the things I'm also trying to personally learn these days, Aileen, is because I recently saw about launching Copilot, right?
Ah,
And I feel so strongly about that. That could be baby steps for supply chain
yeah,
professionals to learn and get comfortable with AI. Because what
exactly.
really blew me in that whole demo was he was showing that you can almost write a prompt in
Hmm.
Excel which can generate a pivot table. Wow,
Isn't that
that's like
amazing?
next. Yeah, because now, because I do supply chain interviews all the time, and currently we ask questions about, do you know the V lookups and H lookups and pivot table and the VBA.
Yes,
Now tomorrow, I think in the next few years, the questions will be more about how can you write an AI prompt in
that's right.
Excel which gives you the right data, right? So I think that's a very good place for even supply chain people to start getting comfortable
Completely
with this new
agree.
technology.
Yeah, I think it's one of the skills all of us need to develop, is prompt writing. And it sounds like it would be a fairly simple thing to learn, but we have to, as humans, begin to edit our language for AI when we're writing prompts. We can't simply ask the tool to give us a better forecast because the tool won't know what better means, right?
True.
So we have to learn to get very precise in our language and then learn to, as you say, look at the output and interpret it so that you can get the next prompt closer to what it needs to be. So that just takes knowing your job, right? So AI is not a replacement for being an expert in your topic. You still need to be an expert in your topic. You need to know the organization that you're working with and what the little variables are that are going to trip up the AI. So definitely get good at your job. But if I were going to say one thing everybody could learn, it's learning to write prompts to be effective.
Absolutely. Now, one question which is not directly AI related, Eileen, but I wanted to ask you because this is also like a technology question. When I think about the manufacturing world, right,
Mhm.
there is a lot of talk about using like the IoT
Mhm.
and digital twins and all of that. How are you seeing that whole industry evolve, and how are you seeing that benefit the world of manufacturing, I would say?
Yeah, so I love IoT on the manufacturing floor or anywhere in the plant. I think because it measures it. Here's what it does. It gives you the data at a very granular level. So it's going to measure differences in stop times between different processes, temperatures, consistencies, all of the data that we actually use to do production and manufacturing. IoT can capture all of those variables either through direct sensors or visual cameras or anything like that. But that creates this gigantic data set. And most people don't see their benefits from like an MES system or even some TMS systems, quite honestly, or even some WMS systems because they don't know how to process the data set. And that's where AI or even robotic process automation, RPA, can make a big difference because it can churn through those gigantic data sets that are otherwise just abstract numbers and begin to produce the statistical analysis to identify problems and then predict problems, right? And we saw a really great example of this on a particular production line in Texas. They were producing caulking like you would use in your home. So caulking for bathtubs, caulking for windows, that the things, the squirty stuff, right? They were
Mhm.
having so many micro stops due to lots of different reasons on the line. The micro stops themselves were sort of, they flew past most of the sensors because they were so minute. But when they added up all of the micro stops together, it was pulling drag time on their throughput by about 10%. So by spotting where the microstops were happening, which were otherwise just noise in the system, and then resolving them, they were able to increase their throughput and their overall turnover. So the data set itself is the key there. I think IoT also, when it comes to movement in a warehouse, is another really good example for us supply chain people. Things move constantly in a warehouse. Nothing is still, right? And if it's still, it's only because it hasn't gone out the door yet, right? So things are constantly moving, but keeping track of all of that and then mapping those patterns of movement to optimize them is a nightmare, especially when your biggest focus as a warehouse manager is to get the next pallet out the door. So throw some AI at that. Use IoT to capture the data. Throw AI at that. That'll allow you to visualize the patterns that are happening, identify problems, identify safety zones, all sorts of things that could improve and optimize your operations. It's so funny. As experts, we know the things we need to do, but we often don't have enough time to process the data to find out how to really make it work. So we do kind of small trial POCs that make small improvements. What AI does then is magnify that using the IoT data set and the visualization tools.
And I think that's a great segue to my next question, Aileen, because I think you mentioned several times about the gigantic data sets and the
Yeah,
ability to manage data, right? Because that is really the core capability which we need to build.
it is.
How do you think, from a skill development perspective, I've got actually a few questions in this area, right? One, what kind of new jobs that you see are coming? Now I'm hearing a lot, I'm actually talking a lot about this on my channel as well. Supply chain data analyst and those kind of
Yes.
jobs are becoming more and
Yeah.
more commonplace. But what other jobs do you think are coming in this space, and what is basically the skill set that one needs to build in order to manage those gigantic data sets?
Yeah, I do think, I think you're right. I think the heart of it is data. So if you're going to start anywhere, maybe start with really understanding your data. And I'd like to think of it as like a car. If I were a mechanic, what would I need to know about the car? I need to know the tires and the interior and the exterior and the electronics and the engine and how it's fueled, all of those kinds of things. Data works in the same way. So you've got a million kinds of data, and you need to know where it comes from and where it goes to, how to tell if it's good data, so that's data quality, how to tell if there are any regulations around the data, that's data privacy and data governance, who uses the data access. So that whole set of skills falls under data quality, governance, access type classes is what I would recommend. And what that teaches you to do is how to look at your data in a new way. So often when we look at data today in our daily lives, it's information. Data analysts and data specialists think of it in a different way. They think of it as assets and building blocks. And a few classes in data quality will teach you to shift your perspective. That shift in perspective will then help you understand which part of it you love the most, right? And then how to advise people about data. So you don't necessarily need to become a data analyst or a data scientist, although that can be a lot of fun. So if it calls to you, definitely do that, because it's like game playing to me. I love that part of the job. But as a fundamental, all of us should understand the mechanics of our data, how it works, what's important, what's not important. Because even if we never write a visualization or write an LLM, a large language model, we will at least be able to spot errors and help guide the AI tools that are doing it, so the tools themselves don't run into the same problems.
Yeah, and I think what's really happening here, Aileen, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is if you just go back maybe 5 years or even 10
Mhm.
years, right? There was a very clear distinction between IT and
Yeah.
supply chain. Like the supply
Yeah.
chain guys didn't know IT, IT didn't know supply
Yeah.
chain. And that's where a lot of friction used to happen. I think
Yes.
those lines are getting blurred. And if
Yeah.
I were to connect the dots between this change and even how the supply chain operations reference or the score model has evolved over the years, right? I was actually just giving this
Mhm.
example on a different video a few weeks ago. Maybe when you and I started our careers, the score model was only four parts: plan,
Yeah.
source, make, and deliver.
Yeah.
Now there is plan, source, make, and deliver. There is return, which is basically all
Yeah.
about reverse logistics. And then there is this exciting piece, which is called enable, which I think
Mhm.
doesn't get enough focus that it deserves, which
Yeah.
is all about these roles that you
Yeah.
spoke about, right? So
Exactly.
you could be a supply planner, but if you are in this new world, if you are a supply planner who has these data management skills,
Mhm.
then you can really step up the game in the
Yeah.
supply chain space, because you understand the data side of the equation and you understand the business side of the equation. So
Yeah.
I think that's where the professionals need to build your skills. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think what's happened where IT is converging into supply chain is because at the heart of it, both IT folks like myself and now a supply chain person and yourself, we love our jobs and we want to be really great at it. And we recognize that when we were split apart like that, neither of us were going to win, because we didn't have enough information. We have to start blending in order to keep up and really help our organizations. And data in particular is an area where supply chain people excel at, right? Our entire world is made up of data. We're constantly monitoring so much data moving at high speeds across our processes in order to make sure things are working well. So stepping just a little bit further into understanding the data mechanics, the structure, the flow, the governance around it, compliance, that's a natural extension of what we do in supply chain. And our analytical brains are constantly calculating things anyway. So adding a few new tools like we're coming out in the AI toolbox, I think it's a really, really great chance. I think we have a better chance at succeeding as a career path in the next 20 years than, say, some of the sales and marketing roles, or some of the more roles that are a little bit further removed from this kind of fundamental piece of understanding data and then using data to drive decisions. So it's supply chain roles have never looked brighter.
Absolutely. Actually, you remind me of a quote from one of my GMs in my business, and he says that supply chain is the new marketing, right? Because
Yes.
we started like 20 years ago, marketing
Yeah.
had these cool jobs, but
Yeah.
with all these technologies now coming in, supply chain jobs are becoming
Agree
more and more
completely. Yeah.
attractive for
Yeah.
sure. Now we have talked about like upskilling, and we have talked about all
Mhm.
the technologies. Aileen, now I want to kind of change the discussion
Mhm.
to employers, right? So how can companies use these changing trends in order to future proof their organization in terms of skill
Yeah.
set? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. If I were a hiring manager these days, in order to protect my organization, I'd be really concerned about getting the right kind of talent, because the landscape has changed significantly. Not only are the skills different, the people are very different than they were, particularly at the entry level. And then what's going to be happening in the next 10 to 15 years is even harder. And those folks like me who kind of stumble into it, there aren't as many of us anymore because of the way the education systems work, right? We're like routed into the roles that we have today. So the flexible thinkers are a little bit more rare. So if I'm an HR person, I'm going to be really concerned about that, because I need leaders. And I need leaders in particular who can lead both AI and humans, right? So human leadership, we've all been working on this for a really long time, and we understand how to bring out the best in people. But how do I find a leader who knows how to bring out the best in AI? Because that's a thing. That will be a thing. We're going to have AI agents doing jobs that humans used to do. They're going to need to be managed. You can't let them just run wild, or you end up with Terminator and Skynet, right? So how do you learn to manage those kinds of things? And how do I find people who can articulate an AI strategy? So what I would advise there is really, as individuals who are interested in leadership and interested in progressing our careers, think about what that would mean. Jamil, what would you do if you had to manage both people and these 3 AI bots that did forecast extraction or data analysis for you? What are you going to need to know about them? How are you going to need to work with them? What will they do instead of what humans will do? So thinking as ourselves as candidates, thinking about how we would articulate that. And then as hiring managers, what skills should I be looking for? And I think that's one of the top ones. And I think the other one is to look for candidates who can articulate what AI does for their job. And that's something a candidate can reflect on, to say, think about the most burdensome thing that you do in your daily life or in the role description, right? Like we all kind of skim through the role descriptions when we're looking at jobs to say, oh, that's ugh, right? So think about what that means. If you didn't have to do that, what would you do instead? Because if that other thing can deliver value, then that burdensome task is a really good candidate for AI. So think about those things in your daily life, because that creates a business case, not just to sell AI for where you are today, but to explain how AI can deliver value for a future employer.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking, like, some of the most boring elements of a supply
Yeah.
chain job. Take the example of month-end inventory reconciliation, right? If there was an AI bot who could do it, I'm sure a
Right.
lot of people will have a
100%.
great time.
Yeah, exactly. Sign
Yeah.
me up, even if I have to pay for it myself. So
Exactly.
yeah.
That's right. And I think there's something you mentioned, almost like a capability, which I still don't see in companies, like, their leadership principles and
Mhm.
hiring, and that is flexible thinking. I think that's so important. And we still see like a lot of, because because in on my channel I talk about skills all the time. So
Yeah.
I also happen to look at, like, different companies, what kind of leadership principles do they hire
Mhm.
based on. And I think this is still a missing piece in a lot of companies.
100%.
However, there are companies who are doing a fantastic job at this as well, and they already have started building these kind of things, like how can you make not only quicker decisions, but like, how can you uh, evolve your thinking as the different
Exactly.
technologies changes, and how do you bring them on, right? So this is great. Now, one thing which you also mentioned, Aileen, is that educational institutions, right? And we see this increasing gap, right? And yes, I
Mm-hmm.
must admit that supply chain has come from a point where, like you mentioned at the start of the podcast, that it was not taught as a subject. People,
No.
even if they would go for an MBA, there was an MBA in finance or sales or marketing, that was it.
Exactly.
Now supply chain is becoming mainstream, which is a good thing, but I still see that the academics are still, I would say, at least 20 years behind as far as embracing technology is concerned. So if someone, from a university was listening to this podcast, what would your advice be to the professors or the teachers?
I think the I think the easiest way to begin closing the gap is to get out there and go to conferences and expose yourself to real life use cases. So I love university education. I love academics. I have 4 academic degrees in my little toolbox because I love learning. But I've also learned that there's a lot of other ways to learn. And particularly as you get into a subject like supply chain, you have got to get out there and see what people like yourself are doing, Jamil, like what your listeners are doing, what the thought leaders on the ground, what problems they're facing and how they're solving them. And certainly build closer partnerships with industry leaders and then also technology leaders, because technology is always going to look at it from a little bit more neutral lens, which doesn't make it right, but it gives you that other perspective. So, make it a 3-way tripartite relationship. You, the academic, or you, the student, or you, the grad student, are actively attending conferences or webinars, in person or virtual, making contacts, having coffee with people to hear what their problems are, so that you can begin expanding your thinking. You may not find the answers to all these problems, but you're going to hear a lot more problems than you do see in a textbook. And you're going to feel the pain of those problems, which is inspiring and builds passion.
Absolutely. And I think one thing I keep advising my clients, or even anyone who comes for advice, is that we are living in such an amazing world where there's so much knowledge out there. Imagine, like, even a podcast like this, right?
Yeah.
People didn't have access to this kind of content in the past. You would probably, even if you wanted to go to a conference, you have to spend a lot of money, which
Right.
I think still it's a good idea. Investing in yourself is always a good idea. But there is so much content available out
Yes.
there, and you don't have to necessarily travel all the time.
That's right.
So, but I think the key game changer has to be, like, instead of people wasting time
Yeah.
on WhatsApp and like social media and content consumption,
Yeah.
become either a content creator or use this
Yeah.
content to your advantage. How
Yeah.
can you
Exactly.
basically apply this on your job, and so on and so forth. Now, as we come towards the end of this podcast, Aileen, any advice you would like to give to, let's say, a young supply chain professional, maybe 3 or 4 years in the job, and they are of course planning to build a full career out of supply chain? What are the few things that you would like to
Yeah.
give out, your words of wisdom, I guess?
I thank you for joining the industry. That's what I would say at the start to anyone just coming into it. And then I would say, remember that it's going to look different in 5 years than what you think it's going to, and 10 years. So don't feel like the choices that you're making today are going to define the exact thing that you're doing today and next year and the year after and the year after. Supply chain paths used to be pretty linear, right? Now they are very networked and very matrixed. You're going to move around a lot in a lot of different roles. And the way to navigate that is to find the things that you really enjoy doing. It's important to make yourself uncomfortable and to learn new things, but you don't want to put yourself in a position where you hate your job. So begin to be aware of what you enjoy about supply chain and then look for those kinds of opportunities, because you get the chance to move all throughout the supply chain. I'm now working in the procurement raw material side of supply chain, where I was always distribution before. It's a completely different world that is also very familiar. So don't box yourself in. Your career can be very big and very engaging if you understand what you enjoy about it.
Excellent. I think that's a great advice, and I think the one difference is that uh, maybe a few decades ago, it was only about moving upwards, right? Because that
Right.
was the only way you could make more money or grow faster,
Right.
right? But now I think the richness of the experience matters
Exactly.
more, and you might end up anyways making more money through that
That's
experience, because
right.
God knows like where that technology leads you
That's
to, and you might
exactly
be
right.
become the matter expert at something
That's
which is
right.
a completely new technology, right? So I
Yeah,
think
you
that's
can move laterally and still make more money if you're moving to a part of the organization or in the organizational structure that delivers more value and naturally gets paid higher, right? So it's no longer an upward trajectory where you're going to be your boss and then your boss's boss and then your boss's boss's boss. You're going to move all throughout the organization. So don't limit your options.
Absolutely. That's great. And then my last question, Aileen, and I always ask this question to any experienced professional like yourself who I invite to the podcast. And then hopefully, once I've got like a number of podcasts done, I would like to compile this and make like a full blown, like, $1 million tips out of this, which
Okay.
is, what is one advice you would like to give your 25-year-old self?
Oh, Oh, 25-year-old Aileen still hadn't started working in supply chain yet. So I would say, hey, check this out. Talk to that warehouse manager because you love complex problems and supply chain is where it's at. Right? There are no better puzzles than what we get in supply chain. And every decision that we make makes a difference. So Aileen, 25-year-old Aileen wanted to save the world, and maybe supply chain doesn't like come across as the hero role all the time, but it is, right? Every decision we make impacts every other decision. The work we do is networked and connected. We work with some of the smartest, most creative people in the world. So 25-year-old Aileen, take a look at it. You would love it. You're going to love it.
Excellent. Great. Thanks a lot, Aileen. So, yeah, I think with that, we come to the end of the podcast. I think, once again, thanks a lot for
Thank
coming on this podcast. I
you.
think this
Yeah.
would be very actionable 30 minutes for anybody who is going to watch this, because especially if you are interested in taking your career to the next level and prepare for what the future holds for supply chain. So thanks, Aileen, for coming.
Thank you.
And absolutely, I would like to invite you more on this podcast as we get further into the world of technology.
I would love that. It's so great to talk with you, Jamil, and so nice to meet all your viewers.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
See you.
you. Thanks.